My mother told me that we needed to clear out the ivy bed in our backyard by the stairs. We had a little hill in the backyard, and there were some stone stairs and an ivy bed on either side. Apparently there were weeds growing up in it, some big ferny little plant things and big tall grass, and apparently it was my job to clear out these stairs. So I went to our little back tool shed place, and I found this tool thing. It was a long wooden pole and an angled blade with teeth on it. I called it a sling blade. It's not really, but I thought it sounded cool. And I went out there and I started chopping down all the weeds. And I was going back and forth like crazy. Greenery was flying everywhere. I was a gardener. By the time I was done, there was only dirt on the side of the stairs. My mother came out and surveyed what I had done, and she let out what I will call a scream. She said, "What did you do?" "I got rid of the weeds." "You got rid of the flower bed, the ivy bed." I was like, "I'm 14. I'm not a master gardener. I can't tell the ivy from the weeds. And plus, I found this really cool sling blade. What did you expect?" I got in trouble. You know, weeds are kind of an interesting phenomenon. How we decide what is a weed is largely based on our own perspective. So how does God define who the weeds are? So I wanted our house back in Peoria to look nice because we were trying to sell it. The housing market wasn't great there, so you want to have good curb appeal. I watch HGTV. I know what's going on. So I had our lawn nicely mowed, but then it was May, and all of a sudden, all these yellow flowers started poking up. Our yard was filled with dandelions. It disrupted our nice green lawn filled with grass. I needed some weed killer, something to keep the dandelion weeds from coming back. After all, dandelions are the problem, right? Grass is good, weeds are bad. But in this parable, a weed is defined in contrast to the wheat on the basis of its lack of a viable grain. Weeds had no nutritional value. If a weed is a plant that has no nutritional value, then American suburbia is filled with fields of highly invasive, aesthetically comforting weeds that we like to call grass. We trim these lovely weeds once a week to the same height if we mow our lawn. It's harder if you put forks in your lawn. Looking at y'all over there. But the reason that these weeds have been cultivated for use in our lawn is because they're able to quickly saturate a large plot of land with their roots and not allow any other species of plant to grow there, so that our yard has a nice, lovely, uniform shade of green that our house guests and neighbors can admire. I heard a story after the first service that you have a herbal garden here on the grounds, and one of the biblical herbs is a dandelion plant. And they had it planted out there. They had a nice little paddle and sign. But somebody came along and said, "Oh no, there's a weed growing in this nice garden. I better pluck it out." And they came back to the garden. There was no dandelion plant. Somebody mistook it for a weed. According to Jesus' parable, if some of the dandelion plants invade my lawn and start growing there, they aren't weeds that need to be yanked out, but a tiny, fragile kingdom of fruitful plants in a sea of worthless weeds. Dandelions are actually one of the earliest sources of food for bees, and we need bees to pollinate the flowers. I like honey mustard, so I need bees for that. Dandelions can be used for tea, for salads, for food, and yet, because our culture has determined them to be different, to be a nuisance, not fit the idea of a uniform lawn that we like and are comfortable with, they are deemed weeds that they are pulled and killed and kept from coming back. The first church I served in a rural town in Illinois, and the congregation had been declining for years, so they were hoping a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, young 24-year-old minister would bring a new spark of life to their church. We started having some new people come. This one family. They didn't wear what were considered Sunday clothes, though. No suit, no tie, just shorts and kind of a battered t-shirt. They were a family with young kids who couldn't exactly sit still and quiet during worship. They couldn't put much on the offering plate, but they were the kind of people thirsting to know God. One of our elders grabbed me after I had been talking to this family after worship and said, "I know you're new here and you have some ideas, but I just wanted to give you some advice. Don't waste your time and energy on those people. We need to get some people in here that can afford us, can give a bit more money, who fit in a bit better. Let them find another church that they fit in more to." My heart just sank. This family may not have looked like everyone in the congregation, been able to financially support it the way some other people might have, but they had a hunger and a passion and a kindness to them. They would have fed that church in so many ways, but they were pulled and tossed away with the other weeds. It didn't matter what I said to that family or how I acted. The church let them know that they were a weed, and it wasn't long before I didn't see them anymore. When we deem something a weed, it is often pulled and killed and kept from coming back. 2 years later, that family was active in another church. The parents helped start and lead a program for kids that many children in the town eventually started coming to. That church grew in families and children. And our congregation kept asking, why don't we have more children in church? Why aren't we growing? They were too busy weeding to plant. It's a natural impulse. Pull the weeds, get rid of the weeds, make the stairs in the backyard look nicer, make the church more comfortable, more homogeneous, more manageable. Pull the weeds and put down some preen, some treatment, some new rules, some customs, and laws that keep them from coming back. The church has been trying to do weed control since before there was a church. Way back in the Bible, in the early pages, you'll find the lawn doctors, the weed men and women. No foreigners allowed in the assembly of God, weeds. No eunuchs by birth, accident, or choice, weeds. No women teaching. After all, they all property, at least according to biblical marriage laws. They should just submit to their husbands and not wear jewelry. Neat, weeds. No Gentiles, they can't be involved with us, weeds. No slaves, they can't worship with us, weeds. There was so much weed control happening in the early church, more like a youth with a sling blade than a master gardener carefully picking over a garden, that Paul had to be clear. Listen, people, there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. See, in their exclusion and their weeding, they were killing the very heart and purpose of their faith community. It looked better to them at first, but the very heart of the gospel was being pulled and poisoned. God said, in the harvest, I'll take care of all that. I'm the only one who knows weed from wheat, so you leave it alone. What? Just leave the weeds in there with the wheat. Have the wheat and the weeds together? I mean, you don't want a garden overrun with weeds, so why would you want a church filled with undesirable things that slowly take over? But the boss said, leave the weeds alone. But they're cluttering the ground, they're taking them. Leave the weeds alone. Why? Because you'll do more harm than good, he says. If you start pulling the weeds, you're going to pull up some of the wheat. We had this flower bed around this little lamp post in our front yard, filled in the fall with different colored mums. My wife loves mums. And there was some weeds starting to come up around it in the fall, and it wasn't looking as pretty. So I wanted to make it look nice. You know, I love my wife and everything. She likes these flowers. I'm going to take care of the flower garden. So I went out there and I pulled the weeds, and I got my little pump sprayer thing and sprayed the weeds. Everything was good. I was a gardener. I looked at my thumb. It looked green to me. Winter came, all good. Spring came, everything looks great. Summer, still good. In the fall, no mums. My wife said, Stephen, where are the mums? Where are my mums? Well, I pulled the weeds. You killed the mums. Now, you can chalk that up to me being a very bad gardener, and I will admit that. But it happens with professionals, too. At the church in Peoria, we had a nice memorial garden filled with flowers and landscaping. In the spring, it would just bloom and pop with color. We hired a professional lawn service to come and to do the fall and the spring cleanup. And one spring, we noticed that it's not quite as colorful as it usually is. Some of the flowers were missing. Apparently, the lawn people had come and they'd pulled the weeds, but they had accidentally pulled the bulbs and the flowers too. It happens to the best of us. Weeds are wheat. Sometimes it's hard to know. See, Jesus is being practical here. He knows it's hard to tell the difference sometimes between weeds and wheat. If you pull the weeds, you'll pull the wheat. And sometimes, as he said, the weeds and the wheat look a lot together. Darnel and wheat, as they grow up, both look the same. Which is weed? Which is wheat? Who is a disruptor who is coming to church and just causing problems? And who is the person really looking for life and meaning? Who's throwing stumbling blocks, and who is just trying to get over the many thrown down in their path in life? What if we've confused the weeds and the wheat? What if our perspective is all wrong? What if we're pulling dandelions when we should really all be pulling up the grass so we can plant something with substance? Do you remember back during World War II, places in this country and in England, they had victory gardens? Do you remember victory gardens? There's a shortage of food. You needed your lawn space to have a garden. There was so much extra food, people wanted to build gardens. And now when there's a worldwide shortage of food, children around the world are hungry, we might have a half acre just of pretty grass, not gardens. When there was a need, oh yeah, we need the garden. And now we like the grass. I wonder. It brings up kind of an interesting question. I'm a little hesitant to ask it, but it's kind of in my mind. What if the very thing that churches across the country are working so hard to preserve and maintain, because that's what they think church membership and programs and mission and worship looks like, is actually the very thing that's keeping the substantial, nourishing, needed growth from happening? What if churches are so intent on maintaining the lawn, they're not planting the garden? Have you ever thought about that? Weeds are wheat. Are you sure you know the difference? I'm not. Have you heard of a guy named James Thornwell? If you had been a member of Derry Presbyterian in the mid-19th century, you most certainly would have heard of James Thornwell. Thornwell was the most significant theologian of the Presbyterian Church in the 1800s, a brilliant scholar, faithful church person. In the winter of 1861, Thornwell joined others from across the church in the South to form what would be known as the Southern Presbyterian Church, at a church in Augusta, Georgia, where Woodrow Wilson's father was the pastor. The country was split north and south, and so was the church. Church leaders gathered to address the presenting issue of the day. They explained how owning slaves created no conflict with following Jesus whatsoever. Thornwell wrote, and I quote, "There are many rights which are owed to other people, the English, the French, the slave master, for example, but not the slave, because God had not fashioned the slave to meet the responsibility that accompanies those rights." In other words, God made the slaves lower than everyone else. They couldn't handle freedom. They didn't deserve the rights of other people. They did not have the light of God in them. That's why their skin was dark, according to the theologians of the day, an absence of the light of God. According to Thornwell, the slaves were weeds and were created that way. And this is a theologian, one of the most educated and respected theologians of all America. And at this point, I think we'd all say, he got that wrong. I hope we all can agree on that, right? Let me see your head shake and nod. Brilliant, educated man, he confused weeds from wheat. I might make the same mistake. You might make the same mistake. There may be folks that we think are the weeds, the troublemakers, the ones who lead people astray, people with theologies or politics we think are wrong, weeds choking out the wheat. But with that said, there may be others who think we are not the wheat, that we are the weeds. I tried to meet with this church pastor up the hill from the church I served in Peoria to talk about how churches could partner together to really help the community. Instead of competing, how can we pull our resources together and help? But he said, I can't meet with y'all. Y'all down there at the bottom of the hill, I'm not even sure you're a Christian. We can't associate with you. We were the weeds. He was the wheat. At least in his mind. So who gets to decide? Who determines who is wheat and who is weed? Who gets to wield the sling blade or do the plucking and pulling? God said, in the harvest, I'll take care of that. I'm the only one who knows weed from wheat, so you leave it alone. And you know what? That's good news. It takes the sling blade out of potentially very dangerous hands. And you know what's even better news? God came to earth in the person of Jesus Christ so we can stop pulling ourselves apart and be pulled into the grace and family of God. We're so tempted to clear things out, leave just what we think is desirable, what we like, what we're comfortable with. It's almost our instinct to sort and to weed, but Jesus calls us to something different, something better, something harder, but ultimately more beautiful and gracious. Gracious inclusion, weeds with wheat. This meal we're about to share symbolizes our oneness with God. It's an open table, welcoming for all. There's no gardener here with shears ready to pluck you out if you don't pass any sort of weed or wheat test. Because you're worthy for this table. You're worthy not because of what you've done or not done, not because you're classified as weed or wheat. You are worthy because Christ says you are worthy. Out of Christ's own heart, Christ looks at each one of you and says, you are worthy enough for my body to be broken. You are worthy enough for my blood to be shed. It's not about you, it's about me and my love. And my love says you come and you eat. So don't pull the weeds. You may just pull some of the weed out too. Because we don't know. We just don't know. But we do know we are all welcome at this table, Christ's table. Forgiveness, love, acceptance, grace right here, and it's for you and it's for all. Weeds or wheat, it doesn't matter, not here. Come and eat. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Today, we all eat from one loaf. We are not separated, gluten-free bread, gluten bread. We share in one meal as one family, one body, eating one loaf together. This is Christ's table. He beckons all. He calls you. Come to my table. Come and feast.